Paul McCartney said. "Don't change a note." Jimi Hendrix played one note. And Paul's face changed completely. After that moment, nothing was the same. London. February 1967. A small studio off Denmark Street. The kind of place where Beatles sessions sometimes spilled over into late nights when Abbey Road was booked. Wood paneling. Low ceilings. Ampex tape machines humming in the corner. The air thick with cigarette smoke and the residue of a dozen recordings that week. Paul McCartney stood near the mixing board, arms crossed, watching the session players set up. He'd been working on arrangement ideas for what would eventually become a track on Sgt. Pepper's. The orchestra parts were sketched. The structure was solid. He just needed to hear it with real instruments before committing it to tape. Jimi Hendrix wasn't supposed to be there. He'd come with Chas Chandler, his manager, who was friends with the engineer. They were supposed to just drop by, say hello, maybe listen for a bit before heading to another session across town. Jimi had been in London for 4 months. He was making waves in the clubs. His reputation was spreading fast among musicians who'd seen him play, but he hadn't broken through to the mainstream yet. He was still the American guitarist some people were whispering about. The one who played with his teeth. The one who set his guitar on fire. Paul knew who he was. Everyone in the London music scene knew by then. Curiosity, mostly. Some skepticism. A lot of talk about showmanship versus substance. When Jimi walked into the studio carrying his Stratocaster, Paul had looked up from the score sheets and nodded. Polite. Professional. The kind of acknowledgement one working musician gives another. "Jimi Hendrix," Chas said, making the introduction. "This is Paul McCartney." They shook hands. Jimmy's grip was light, almost hesitant. He didn't make eye contact for long. He moved to the corner of the room and sat down on a wooden stool, the Stratocaster resting across his lap, and became very still. The session continued. Paul was working with a cellist and a French horn player, trying to lock in a particular phrase. It wasn't coming together. The cellist kept rushing. The horn player couldn't find the right tone. Paul was getting frustrated. Not angry, but that particular kind of creative friction when you can hear something perfectly in your head and can't translate it to the room. "Let's take 5, Paul said finally, rubbing his eyes. The musicians set down their instruments. Someone went to make tea. The engineer adjusted levels on the board. The room settled into that particular studio silence, not empty, but waiting. Jimi hadn't moved from his stool. He'd been sitting there for 40 minutes, watching, saying nothing. His fingers occasionally moved across the strings of his guitar, so quietly no one could hear it through the room noise. Just feeling the instrument. Just thinking. Paul walked over to him. Casual. "You play, right?" It was a strange question to ask Jimi Hendrix. But Paul didn't know yet. "Not really." Jimi looked up. Nodded once. "Want to hear what we're working on?" Another nod. Paul explained the arrangement. The chord progression. The melody line he was trying to get the horn to capture. The feeling he was going for. Something between melancholy and hope. Something that sounded like remembering a place you've never actually been to. Jimi listened without interrupting. When Paul finished, Jimi asked his first question of the day. "Can I hear it once more?" They played it through. Jimi closed his eyes. His head moved almost imperceptibly with the rhythm. When they finished, he opened his eyes and looked at his guitar. "You want to try something?" Paul asked. "If that's all right." Paul gestured to the open floor. "Go ahead." Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Jimi stood slowly. Walked to the center of the small studio. Plugged his Stratocaster into one of the spare amplifiers, a small Fender, nothing fancy. He adjusted the volume to barely above conversation level. The kind of setting where you could hear every nuance, every hesitation, every choice. He positioned himself, that slightly awkward stance that would later become iconic. He looked at Paul. "Just play the chord progression?" Jimi asked. "Exactly as written," Paul said. There was something in his voice now. Not aggression, but certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from being Paul McCartney in 1967, from being one of the Beatles, from knowing you're at the center of the musical universe. Don't change a note. Let's see what you do with what's there. It wasn't quite a challenge. But it wasn't quite friendly either. Jimmy nodded. His face didn't change expression. He looked down at his guitar. And then he played. One note. Just one. A single note that he let sustain, bending it slightly, letting it breathe and decay naturally. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. It wasn't technical. It was just complete. The room went silent in a different way than before. Everyone stopped what they were doing without realizing they were stopping. The cellist set down her tea. The engineer's hand froze on a fader. Chas Chandler, who'd heard Jimmy play 100 times, looked up sharply. Because that one note shouldn't have carried what it carried. It was the exact note Paul wanted. But it was also something else. It had weight. It had memory. It had the melancholy Paul was trying to capture, but it also had something Paul hadn't thought to include, a kind of acceptance. A recognition that melancholy isn't a problem to be solved but a place to sit with for a while. Paul's mouth opened slightly. He was going to say something. But the note was still ringing, and saying anything would have been interrupting. Jimmy played the second note. Then the third. Following Paul's progression exactly. Not changing anything. But completely changing everything. He wasn't showing off. There was no flash. No speed. No tricks. He was just playing the progression as written, except every note sounded like it had been waiting its entire existence to be played exactly that way in exactly that moment. The cellist started crying. Not obviously. Just tears suddenly on her cheeks that she didn't wipe away. Jimmy played through the entire progression once. When he finished, he let the last note decay completely. Silence. Then he looked up at Paul. Paul McCartney stood frozen, one hand still raised in the gesture he'd been making when Jimmy started playing. His face had completely transformed. Not angry. Not defensive. Something else. Something that looked like recognition mixed with something that might have been grief. Because in that moment, Paul understood something he hadn't wanted to understand. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. Play it again, Paul said. His voice was different now. Quieter. No certainty in it. Jimmy played it again. Exactly the same notes. Exactly the same progression. And somehow it was even more devastating the second time because now everyone in the room knew what was coming, and it still destroyed them. When Jimmy finished, Paul walked over to him. Close. He looked at the Stratocaster, at Jimmy's hands still resting on the strings, at the amplifier producing this impossible sound at barely above speaking volume. How? Paul asked. One word. Not hostile. Genuinely asking. Jimmy looked at him. You wrote it right, he said quietly. I just played what was already there. No, Paul said. I wrote notes. That wasn't notes. Jimmy didn't respond. He didn't need to. Paul turned to the engineer. Were we recording that? The engineer shook his head. No, you called a break. I'd stop tape. Something passed across Paul's face. Relief, maybe? Or regret? Or both? He turned back to Jimmy. Will you play on the track? It was an extraordinary offer. Paul McCartney asking someone to play on a Beatles recording. In 1967. It would have been the opportunity of a lifetime for almost any guitarist in the world. Jimmy looked at his guitar for a long moment. Then he looked at Paul. No, he said softly. Thank you. But this is yours. What you heard just now, that's for you to figure out how to get there. Not for me to give you. Paul's jaw tightened. Not in anger. In understanding. If I'd recorded it, Paul said slowly, I would have just copied it. And that would have been cheating. Yeah, Jimmy said. But now I know it's possible. Yeah. Paul nodded. He reached out and shook Jimmy's hand. Different from before. This time he held the grip a moment longer. Thank you, Paul said. Jimmy just nodded. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. He sat back down on his stool in the corner, unplugged his guitar, set it carefully on its stand, and became very still again. The session resumed 10 minutes later. Paul worked with the cellist and horn player for another 2 hours. The arrangement came together differently than he'd originally imagined. Slower. More space between the notes. More willingness to let things breathe and decay. Jimmy stayed the entire session. Watching. Not playing. Just present. When it wrapped, as people were packing up, the cellist approached Jimmy. "I've been playing cello for 20 years, she said. "That's the first time I've cried during a session." "You played beautifully," Jimmy said. "No. I played technically. You played." She stopped, searching for the word. "He played honestly," Paul said. "He was packing his sheet music, but he'd been listening. That's the word. Honestly." Jimmy looked at Paul. Paul looked back. There was no competition in it now. No measurement. Just two craftsmen acknowledging something that had passed between them. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. 3 months later, Jimi Hendrix released Are You Experienced? 6 months after that, he played Monterey Pop Festival and became a legend. A year later, he was the highest paid performer in the world. But that night in the small studio off Denmark Street remained private. The 5 people who were in the room never talked about it publicly. Not during Jimmy's lifetime. Not after he died. It was somehow too personal. Too revealing. Not of Jimmy, but of everyone else. Because what Jimmy had done wasn't show them how good he was. He'd shown them what music could be if you stopped trying to own it and just let it move through you. The cellist kept a handwritten note on her music stand for the rest of her career. It just said, "Play honestly." The engineer, years later, said it was the one session he wished he'd recorded more than any other in 40 years of making albums. Paul never forgot what that single note taught him. He talked about it only once, in an interview in the 1990s, when he was asked about moments that changed his approach to music. "I was at the height of everything," Paul said. Beatles, fame, success, believing I knew what music was. And this quiet guy played one note that showed me I'd been thinking about it all wrong. Not wrong, just incomplete. He didn't take anything from me. He just showed me there was further to go. "Did you ever thank him?" the interviewer asked. "I did. That night." But not enough. Jimmy's guitar from that session, the Stratocaster he'd sat with for 40 minutes before playing those perfect notes, is now in a museum. The placard mentions his major performances, his innovations, his legacy. It doesn't mention the night he played Paul McCartney's chord progression without changing a single note, and in not changing it, changed everything. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Because mastery isn't proving you're better. It's showing someone else what they could become if they stopped measuring and started listening. In the years that followed, Paul McCartney would occasionally reference that night in private conversations with other musicians. Not as a story of competition lost, but as a story of understanding gained. He described it as the moment he stopped thinking of music as something to control and started thinking of it as something to serve. The engineer who'd been there that night kept detailed session logs his entire career. In the margin next to February 14, 1967, he'd written just 4 words in pencil. Hendrix played one note. Years later, going through his archives, his daughter asked him why that entry was different from all the others. Why just one note warranted documentation. "Because," he told her, "some people spend their whole lives playing thousands of notes, trying to say something. And some people play one note and say everything." The wooden stool where Jimmy sat that night remained in that studio for another 15 years. It became something of an unspoken tradition among session musicians who knew the story, They wouldn't sit on it during sessions. It wasn't superstition. It was respect. A reminder that real mastery doesn't announce itself. It just sits quietly in the corner until called upon, and then it changes the world with the simplest possible gesture. When Jimi Hendrix died in 1970, Paul McCartney attended a small private memorial. He didn't speak publicly, but those close to him knew he carried something from that February night in 1967, an understanding that the greatest gift one artist can give another isn't competition or collaboration, but the quiet demonstration that there are no ceilings, only horizons. The note Jimi played that night existed for maybe 3 seconds, but its resonance lasted lifetimes.